My name is Mara Ashford. I'm 31 years old. And 11 months ago, my father stood up in front of 470 guests at the Ashford Group's annual charity gala, the most prestigious social event in our city, pointed directly at me, and told the entire room that I had always been the family's greatest disappointment. He said it slowly, into the microphone, with a smile on his face. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man standing quietly beside me, the man they had spent 2 years calling a nobody, a blue-collar fraud, a gold digger who didn't belong in our world, had personally negotiated the acquisition of the Ashford Group's largest corporate client 3 days earlier. And that client had already signed paperwork transferring their contract to a new holding company, a holding company that was registered in my name. By the time my father finished his speech, the company he had spent 40 years building had already started to bleed. And the room was about to find out. Before I tell you how all of this happened, and I promise I'm going to tell you everything, tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. People write in from countries I've never even visited, and it genuinely moves me to know that what I went through resonates with someone halfway around the world. And if you've ever had a family member look straight through you like you weren't worth seeing, if you've ever been the one left out of the photo, the last to be told the news, the person who had to hear about your own family's achievements from strangers, hit subscribe, because this story is for you. Let me start at the beginning, because if I don't, none of the rest of it will make sense. My father's name is Richard Ashford. If you live in the Pacific Northwest and you've ever bought commercial real estate, financed a construction project, or attended a business fundraiser in the last 3 decades, you've almost certainly heard his name. The Ashford Group is a real estate development and property investment firm that my grandfather started in the 1970s with a single office building and a vision that was, I'll give him credit, genuinely impressive for its time. By the time my grandfather handed it to my father in 1994, the company was already worth close to $40 million. By the time I was born, my father had tripled that. By the time I was in college, the Ashford Group was one of the 5 largest private real estate firms in the state. And my father never once let anyone in his life forget it. He is the kind of man who introduces himself to waitstaff by his full name and company title. The kind of man who corrects other people's grammar at dinner parties, even when they're not speaking to him. He has a firm handshake and a cold smile, and I grew up watching him light up entire rooms the same way a spotlight works, with heat that only ever points in one direction. My mother, Diana Ashford, was a former model who married my father when she was 24 and spent the next 30 years treating her social calendar like a second career. She is graceful in the way that certain kinds of cruelty can look graceful from far away. She says cutting things in a soft voice and calls it honesty. She once told me, when I was 12 years old and crying after a school recital, that I should find a talent I was actually good at. Not with meanness, just very calmly, the way you tell someone they had spinach in their teeth. And then there was my brother, Daniel. Daniel Ashford is 3 years older than me, and from the moment he was old enough to shake hands and look men in the eye, he was everything my father wanted in an heir. He was tall, athletic, charming in a practiced way, and completely uninterested in anything that couldn't be monetized. He played lacrosse. He drove the right car. He said the right things at the right events. He went to my father's alma mater and graduated with a business degree and a network of connections that my father had spent years curating for him. I went to a state university on a partial academic scholarship, studying civil engineering, and paid the rest of my tuition myself. That detail is important. I want you to hold on to it. My father offered to pay Daniel's tuition, his housing, his car, his study abroad trip to London, and a generous monthly allowance throughout college. When I was accepted to the engineering program and sat down with my parents to talk about school, my father told me that he believed strongly in children learning the value of money and that he wouldn't be paying for my education, but that he'd be very proud of me, whatever I chose to do. I remember my mother nodding like he'd said something wise. Daniel was sitting at the same table. Nobody said anything about the difference. Nobody acknowledged it. It just sat there in the room like furniture that had always been there, so ordinary that pointing it out would have seemed strange. I didn't say anything either. I was 18. I didn't yet have the language for what was happening to me. What I didn't know then was that this pattern, this quiet, systematic erasure, had been going on my entire life, and that it would get much worse before it ever got better. I graduated with my engineering degree in 4 years and took a job with a mid-sized structural engineering firm in Portland. I was good at my job. Actually, I was better than good. Within 18 months, I was leading projects. Within 3 years, I was managing a small team. And by the time I was 27, I had been promoted to senior project engineer and was overseeing a commercial development contract worth over $12 million. I did not tell my family most of this, not because I was hiding it, but because they never asked. Every family dinner, which happened about once a month at my parents' house, a 7-bedroom colonial in a gated neighborhood that my father had bought in 1998 and renovated twice, follow the same script. My father would talk about the Ashford Group. My mother would talk about whatever charity event or foundation board she was currently involved with. Daniel would update everyone on his latest project at the company, always framed as though he'd done it entirely alone, and my parents would nod and praise and refill his glass. Then someone would ask me a vague question like, "How's the job going?" And when I started to answer, my father would interrupt to tell Daniel something he just remembered, or my mother would get up to check on the food. Once, I was 26, I remember because it was just after I'd won a state engineering award. I tried to bring it up at dinner. I said, casually, that I'd received an award from the State Engineering Association that week. My mother said, "Oh, how nice," the same way she'd say it if I told her I'd found a good parking spot. My father said, "Speaking of awards, Daniel, tell them about the commercial real estate recognition you got last month." And the conversation turned immediately and completely like a river rerouted around a rock. I sat there with my fork in my hand and something in my chest that I didn't know what to do with. I thought that was just how it was. I thought maybe I wasn't interesting enough. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong without knowing it. I told myself 100 stories about why it made sense, because the alternative, that my own parents had simply decided I mattered less, was too enormous to hold at 26. I wouldn't fully understand it until much later. I met Joel Reyes when I was 28 years old, at a coffee shop near my office, where I went every morning for an Americano and the small private ritual of 20 minutes alone before the workday started. He was sitting at the table across from me, and he had a technical drawing spread out on the table that I recognized immediately because it was a structural load diagram, and he was frowning at it in a way that told me he was genuinely puzzled, not just performing puzzlement the way people do when they want someone to ask them about it. I leaned over and said, without thinking, "You've got your lateral force distribution wrong. The load path is going to be asymmetric." He looked up. He had dark brown eyes and a slight smile that appeared slowly, like he was deciding whether to let it happen, and he said, "Are you a structural engineer?" I said yes. He said he was a contractor, and that he'd been staring at this diagram for an hour trying to figure out why the numbers weren't adding up, and would I be willing to look at it properly. We spent 45 minutes at that coffee shop. I missed my morning meeting. I didn't care. His name was Joel Reyes. He told me he ran a small contracting business. He was 32, calm in a way that felt earned rather than performed, and he listened to people when they talked. Actually listened, not just waited for his turn. He wore work boots and a flannel shirt and had calloused hands that he used to point at the diagram as we talked. And there was something about the way he approached a problem, methodically, without ego, genuinely interested in getting it right, that I found so disarming that I agreed to have lunch with him the following week before I'd even decided to. We dated for 4 months before I told my parents. I should have waited longer. The first time I mentioned Joel at a family dinner, I described him exactly as he described himself to me, a contractor who ran his own business. My father's expression shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fraction of pause before he said, "I see." My mother smiled her careful smile and asked if he had any family in the area. Daniel, across the table, said nothing, but I caught him and my father exchanging a look so quick that if I'd blinked I would have missed it. That look, I've thought about it 100 times since. What I didn't know then was that the conversation happening in that look would echo forward for years and shape everything that came after. But I'll get to that. The next dinner I brought Joel. He was polite, thoughtful, and genuinely warm with my parents in a way that wasn't sycophantic. He asked my father real questions about the company's development projects, engaged with my mother about her foundation work, and thanked them for having him with a sincerity that I, who knew him by then, recognized as completely unperformed. My father spent the dinner talking over him. Not obviously. Not rudely. My father doesn't do obvious. He does sophisticated. Every time Joel began a sentence, my father would wait precisely until Joel had committed to the direction of the thought and then pivot the conversation in a way that left Joel's comment dangling in the air, unresponded to, like a hand nobody shook. By the end of the evening, Joel had been systematically and politely excluded from nearly every exchange at the table. In the car on the way home, I apologized. Joel was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You don't need to apologize for them." Not bitterly, not even sadly, really. Just as a fact. I asked him if he was bothered. He thought about it, really thought about it, and said, "People show you who they are. It's useful information." I didn't know what to do with that at the time. It struck me as either very wise or very unsettling, and I couldn't decide which. Have you ever had someone come into your life who just sees things clearly? Who doesn't perform emotions around other people's cruelty, just observes it and files it away? That was Joel. And being with someone like that, when you've spent your whole life being gaslit into thinking you were imagining things, is the strangest kind of relief. Joel and I dated for a year before I noticed the things that didn't quite add up. They were small things. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they started to form a shape I couldn't name yet. The first time was about 6 months in. We were having dinner at my apartment, and his phone rang, and he glanced at the screen and said, "I need to take this. Sorry, it's a client," with a half-second pause before client, that I noticed but didn't ask about. He stepped outside, and the call lasted 20 minutes, and when he came back in he looked the same as always, just slightly more focused, and I let it go. The second time was when I visited his office. He ran his contracting business out of a space in an industrial part of town, clean and organized, and he had a small team of 5 or 6 people who clearly respected him. But one afternoon I stopped by unannounced, and there were 2 men in the conference room in suits that did not fit the aesthetic of a small contracting operation. They were looking at documents that Joel quickly gathered and closed a folder over when I knocked. He introduced me. They were pleasant. They left within minutes, and Joel explained they were consultants for a commercial project. Something about it sat slightly wrong. I couldn't say why. The third time was when we were at a bookstore, and I pulled a business magazine off the shelf for something to flip through while Joel browsed, and I saw, in passing, a sidebar in an article about Pacific Northwest real estate investment that mentioned a company called Reyes Capital Holdings. I almost turned the page. Then I turned back and read the sentence again. It was brief, 2 lines, describing a private investment group that had acquired a significant stake in a Portland development project. Reyes. I looked up at Joel, who was 20 feet away with his back to me, reading the spine of a novel with that focused expression he got when something genuinely interested him. I looked back at the magazine. I put it back on the shelf. I didn't say anything that night, but I filed it away. What I didn't understand then, what I wouldn't understand until months later, when the whole thing came apart, was that Joel had been protecting me from something. Or maybe protecting himself. Or maybe both. The truth, when I finally learned it, was so much bigger than I'd imagined that I stood in the middle of my kitchen and laughed for almost a full minute before I started crying. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Joel proposed to me on a Tuesday, which I told him was a strange day to propose, and he said most people don't see it coming on a Tuesday, which I had to admit was logically sound. He took me to the same coffee shop where we'd met. He had the structural diagram, the original one, framed, leaning against the table where I'd sat that first morning. The ring was simple, a solitaire on a plain gold band, and when he told me later that he'd spent 3 months finding exactly the right one, I believed him completely because that was how Joel did everything. I said yes before he'd finished the question. I was so happy I couldn't speak properly for about an hour. I kept starting sentences and not finishing them. Joel sat across from me, looking quietly, privately pleased in the way he always looked when something was exactly right. That night, I called my parents to tell them. My mother said, "Oh, Joel the contractor." I said yes. There was a pause. Then she said she was happy for me and asked if we'd set a date, and her voice had the quality it got when she was choosing words carefully, each one placed like something fragile being set down on a glass shelf. My father called me back 20 minutes later. He said, "Mara, I think we should have lunch." I knew what that lunch was going to be. I went anyway because I still believed, at that point, that some part of my father wanted to do the right thing. That if I explained how I felt, if I was clear and direct about what I needed from him, something in him would respond. I still believe that. The lunch was at his club. White tablecloths. A room full of men who looked like my father, dressed like my father, spoke with my father's cadence. He was perfectly kind throughout the appetizers and the soup, asking about my work, asking about the proposal, smiling in the right places. Then our entrees arrived and he set down his fork and said, "I'm going to be direct with you." He said he'd had Joel looked into. He said a few inquiries, which meant he'd hired someone. He said there was nothing there, no significant assets, no business track record that justified a company he'd apparently been running for 8 years, nothing that suggested Joel Reyes was the kind of man a woman in my position should be considering marrying. I asked him what he meant by a woman in my position. He said, "You're an Ashford, Mara." I said I was also a 30-year-old adult who was perfectly capable of choosing her own partner. He said something then that I will never forget. He said, "You've always chosen to do things the hard way. I admire your independence. But this isn't about independence. This is about protecting the family's reputation from someone who may be attaching himself to it for reasons that have nothing to do with love." I sat very still. I looked at my father, at the careful concern on his face, the practiced sincerity, and something in me understood, for the first time with full clarity, that he had never once worried about my happiness. Not once. The concern was entirely architectural. I was a piece of the Ashford Group's social structure, and Joel was a potential structural weakness, and that was the entire sum of my father's interest in my life. I thanked him for lunch, left a folded napkin on the table, and walked out. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where you finally saw someone clearly, and it wasn't sad or angry, it was just like something came into focus? Because that's what that moment felt like. Not devastation, just clarity. I told Joel about the lunch that evening. I told him everything my father said. Joel listened without interrupting, which he always did, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "He had me investigated?" I said yes. Joel nodded slowly, looking at the middle distance, and something passed across his face, not quite amusement, not quite concern, something in between, and he said, "And what do they find?" I repeated what my father had told me. Nothing significant. No substantial assets. No real track record. Joel said, "Okay, just that. Okay." I waited for him to explain, or defend himself, or offer some context. He looked at me with those steady dark eyes and said, "Are you worried?" I said no. I said I was marrying him regardless, and that my father's opinion was no longer something I was making decisions around. Joel said, "Good." And then he poured us both a glass of wine and asked me about the load-bearing specifications on a project I'd been struggling with at work, and we spent the next hour talking about structural engineering like my father hadn't just tried to dismantle the most important relationship in my life. I thought then that his calmness was about trust, that he trusted me, and so he didn't feel the need to perform defensiveness. Later I would understand that there was another layer to it entirely. The next phone call would change everything. 3 months before the wedding, Daniel called me. This was unusual. Daniel and I didn't have a kind of relationship where we called each other. We existed in the same family the way two weather systems can occupy the same region without ever merging, near each other, occasionally turbulent, fundamentally separate. So when his name appeared on my phone at 8:30 on a Wednesday evening, I felt the particular alertness of knowing something had shifted. He told me the family had decided not to attend the wedding. Not my father, not my mother, the family. He used that word deliberately, the way my father always used it, as a singular unit, a monolith, a decision-making body that didn't break down into individual human beings with individual responsibilities. I said, "Excuse me?" He said that my father had serious concerns about Joel, that they had done additional research, and that they believed this relationship was not in my best interests or in the best interests of the Ashford family's reputation. He said they were not going to publicly endorse the marriage by attending the ceremony, and that they hoped I would reconsider my choices before it was too late. He delivered this like a memo. Clean, efficient, no particular warmth. I asked if this was his idea or our father's. He paused just long enough to tell me the answer, and then said, "It's a family decision, Mara." I said, "Okay, Daniel." And I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for about 10 minutes. Not crying, I wasn't crying. Just sitting there with my back against the cabinet, looking at the middle distance, taking inventory of what I felt. Grief was in there somewhere. But underneath it was something else, something harder and quieter, a long-settled recognition that this was always where we were heading. When Joel got home that night and found me sitting on the kitchen floor, he didn't ask what happened immediately. He sat down next to me on the floor, just sat down, in his work clothes, back against the cabinet, and waited. I told him. He listened. When I finished, he said, "I'm sorry. Not for them, for you. You deserved better from them." I leaned my head on his shoulder. He put his arm around me. After a while, I said, "There's something you're not telling me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." I said, "Are you going to tell me?" He said, "Soon. I promise. Before the wedding, I will tell you everything." That detail seemed unimportant at the time. His tone wasn't alarming. It was careful, almost gentle, the way he was when he was deciding how to approach something complicated. I trusted him, so I let it sit. What I couldn't have known then was that what Joel was about to tell me would reframe the previous 2 years of my life entirely. That things I'd noticed and dismissed, the suited men in the conference room, the magazine sidebar, the 20-minute phone call, the particular quality of his patience with my family's contempt, were all pieces of a picture that, when complete, would make my father's investigation look like a child peering through a keyhole at an ocean. Joel told me the week before the wedding. We were at his apartment, his real apartment, not the modest one-bedroom in northeast Portland he'd been renting since before we met, which I'd always thought was unusually clean and unusually bare for someone who'd lived there several years, like a hotel room with better lighting. His real apartment turned out to be a penthouse in a building I'd driven past 100 times, a building that, as it happened, was one of the Ashford Group's developments from 2009. He sat me down at the kitchen table, which had an actual view of the city at night, and he said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I said, "Okay." He said, "My name is Joel Reyes. I'm 33 years old, and I am the founder and principal owner of Reyes Capital Holdings, which is a private real estate investment and acquisitions firm. We currently manage approximately $2.4 billion in assets across the Pacific Northwest, Nevada, and Colorado. I have been operating under the radar deliberately for the past 8 years because I learned early that people treat you very differently when they know how much money you have, and I didn't want to learn that lesson again the hard way." I sat completely still. He said, "The contracting company is real. I started it at 22 with borrowed money because I wanted to understand how buildings actually work before I invested in them. Most of the people who work for me have been there since the beginning. I kept it running because I like the work and because it keeps me honest. But it's not the whole picture." I said, "And I want to be honest about this." I said, "How much is $2.4 billion? He said, "Enough." I said, "Joel." He said, "I know." I think we sat there for 20 minutes before either of us said anything substantial. I wasn't angry. I was trying to integrate 2 versions of a person I loved, and I needed the time to do it properly. The version I'd fallen in love with, methodical, calm, genuine, attentive, the man who sat on the kitchen floor with me, hadn't changed. He was still exactly that, but he had a dimension I hadn't seen, and I needed to understand why he'd kept it hidden. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He said, "Because the last woman I was serious about told me she loved me 6 months in, and I found out later she'd known about the company since our second date. I wanted to know that what we had was real before anything else entered the picture. I needed it to be just us first." He paused and then said, very quietly, "I think I waited too long. I'm sorry." I looked at him across that kitchen table with the city lit up behind him and thought about every dinner where my father had talked over him. Every polite smile from my mother. Every look Daniel had exchanged with my father. All of it, the condescension, the investigation, the decision not to attend the wedding, had been delivered to a man worth more than my father's entire life's work. And Joel had sat through all of it in work boots and flannel and said nothing. What would you have done? Honestly, tell me in the comments. Because I went back and forth on it for weeks. I said yes to the wedding, obviously, but I also said, they need to know before the wedding. I'm not doing it, but they need to know. Joel looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, I was thinking the same thing. I should tell you about the gala, because that's where everything happened, and I need to set the scene properly so you understand the scale of it. The Ashford Group's annual benefit gala is held every October at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown, a building that my grandfather helped develop in the 1980s and that my father considered something close to a personal monument. It raises money for local housing charities, an irony that should not be lost on anyone, and it is the centerpiece of the Ashford family's social year. Black tie, 400 to 500 guests, donors, business partners, city officials, journalists. The kind of event where you cannot do anything privately because everyone who matters is watching. My father invited me to the gala 3 weeks before the wedding. He called personally, which surprised me. He said he wanted to make a gesture, a public acknowledgement that whatever differences we had, I was still his daughter, and the family would welcome my presence at the event. He did not mention Joel. I said I would come, and I would bring my fiancé. There was a pause. He said that was fine. I called Joel and told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, there's something I need to tell you about the gala." I waited. He said, 3 days ago, Coastal Pacific Group, your father's largest commercial client, the one that accounts for about 30% of the Ashford Group's current contract revenue, finalized a decision to transfer their business. They've been unhappy with the Ashford Group's project management for about 18 months. They had a meeting with my team in September, and we offer them better terms and a more experienced operational structure. My heart was going very fast. The contract, Joel continued, is now with Reyes Capital Holdings. The papers were signed Tuesday. Your father doesn't know yet. Their executive team was going to notify him through normal channels this week. It's possible he'll find out before the gala. It's possible he won't. I said, "Joel, did you go after that contract because of my father?" He said, very directly, "No. Coastal Pacific came to us. We didn't pursue them. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be anything you don't know before we walk into that room." I believed him. I still believe him. But I also understood, in that moment, that the universe sometimes arranges things with a particular dark efficiency that no one plans and everyone has to reckon with. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. Joel and I got married in a small ceremony with 22 people, friends, colleagues, a few family members from Joel's side who drove up from California. It was exactly what I wanted. Simple, real hours. My parents did not attend. Neither did Daniel. I wore a dress that cost $300 from a boutique near my office. Joel cried a little when I came down the aisle, which he would deny under oath, but which I have photographs of. Then, 8 days later, we got into a car and drove to the Grand Meridian Hotel. I want to describe the room to you, because rooms matter. The Grand Meridian Ballroom is all gold and white, the kind of space that's been designed to make everyone in it feel like they've arrived somewhere. Tall arched windows, crystal chandeliers, tables dressed in white linen with centerpieces that cost more than most people's grocery budgets. 470 guests in their finest clothes, moving through the space with the specific ease of people who've attended many events like this and know how to be decorative without appearing to try. My father was at the center of it in the way he always was at this event, moving through the room like he owned it, which he effectively did, pausing to shake hands, receiving greetings, laughing at the right moments, leaning in to speak privately into the ears of important people. He was wearing a dark tuxedo and his best watch, and he had the slightly elevated color of a man who was exactly where he believed he was supposed to be. He saw me come in. I watched his face process Joel beside me, the work-casual appearance Joel always maintained at social events, no tuxedo, just well-fitted dark trousers and a simple jacket, which I had stopped trying to convince him to change because I'd come to understand it was deliberate, and I saw the slight tightening of my father's expression before his social face reasserted itself. He came over. He kissed my cheek. He shook Joel's hand and said, "Glad you could make it," in the tone he used for service staff. Joel said, "Thank you for having us, Richard. Come, easy," like a man completely comfortable in his own skin. My mother floated over in silver, kissed me, made the soft noises of someone performing warmth, and steered herself away within 90 seconds. Daniel was across the room and looked up when we entered, looked back down, and did not come over. I thought, they don't know yet. About Coastal Pacific. About any of it. Joel leaned close and said, very quietly, he knows. I looked at him. He tilted his head slightly toward the far side of the room, where a man in a gray suit was standing near the bar with the rigid posture of someone managing bad news. I recognized him. Marcus Webb, one of the Ashford Group's senior executives. Joel said, Marcus called me this afternoon. He wanted to make sure there was no friction tonight. I told him there wouldn't be. I said, when did my father find out? Joel said, this morning. I looked across the room at my father, who was laughing with a city councilman, and understood that what I was watching was performance. That somewhere underneath the tuxedo and the watch and the perfect social fluency, my father had spent the day absorbing the information that his largest client had left him for a company he had never heard of, and he had come to this gala anyway and was performing normalcy at a level that was objectively impressive. The real reason everything was about to explode wouldn't be revealed until later, until the speech, and I think my father must have made a decision during the cocktail hour about what he was going to do. Because what he did was not the action of a man managing a crisis carefully. It was the action of a man who, confronted with something he couldn't control, defaulted to the one thing he'd always been able to control. Me. The program started at 8:30. Dinner, a brief musical performance, remarks from the charity director, and then my father's annual address, his signature moment, the speech he'd been giving variations of for 15 years, the one where he talked about legacy and community and the Ashford family's commitment to the city. I was at table 7 with Joel and 2 couples we didn't know who were pleasant and completely unaware of the atmospheric pressure building in the room. Joel was quiet through dinner in the way he got quiet when he was paying attention to everything simultaneously. I kept my hands in my lap and ate very little and watched my father at the head table across the room. At 9:15, Richard Ashford took the microphone. He thanked the charity director. He thanked the donors. He talked about his grandfather's vision and his father's determination and his own 30 years of work. He was articulate and warm and compelling, the way he always was at this podium, and the room was with him completely. Then he paused. He looked out at the room and he said, I want to take a moment tonight to acknowledge something personal, because the Ashford name means something. It means something to this community, to our partners, and to the next generation. And it is important when we talk about legacy to be honest about what that legacy requires. The room was very still. I felt Joel put his hand over mine on the table. My father said, my daughter Mara is here tonight. Some of you know her. She is talented and hardworking, and I want to believe she has her grandfather's drive somewhere in her. But talent without judgment is not enough. Not for an Ashford. Not for a family that has spent 40 years building something real in the city. He paused again. He was looking at me now, directly across the room. 470 people followed his gaze. He said, Mara recently made a decision that I believe reflects a failure of judgment. She has chosen to align herself with an individual who is not what he represents himself to be. She has rejected her family's counsel, and in doing so, has placed herself and the Ashford name in a position that I can no longer publicly support. I say this not with anger, but with the painful honesty of a father who has always wanted better for his child than she has wanted for herself. He said, as of tonight, Mara is no longer part of the Ashford Group family in any capacity. The room was completely silent. I felt it, the weight of 470 people's attention, the particular quality of public humiliation, which is not like private humiliation at all. It has a physicality. It lands on the chest. I felt my face go very still, the way faces do when the body understands that the wrong reaction will be remembered. I looked at my father at the podium. I looked at my mother at the head table, whose expression was composed into something that was not quite sadness and not quite satisfaction, but was somewhere between them. I looked at Daniel, who was looking at the table. Then I looked at Joel. Joel was looking at my father with an expression of complete, almost scientific calm. He was not angry. He was not distressed. He looked, if anything, like a man watching a very predictable outcome resolve exactly as expected. He turned and looked at me. His eyes asked, are you okay? I took one long, slow breath. I looked back at the podium, where my father was setting the microphone down with the satisfied air of someone who had handled something that needed handling. And then I said quietly to Joel, okay. He understood what that meant. Joel stood up, not dramatically, Not urgently. He folded his napkin, set it on the table, pushed back his chair, and stood up with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided what they were going to do and saw no reason to perform it. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me once more. Then he walked toward the podium. My father was already stepping away from the microphone, accepting the hand of someone who'd leaned in to congratulate him on his courage. He didn't see Joel coming until Joel was 6 feet away. Joel said, "Richard, I'd like a moment with the microphone, if you don't mind." My father stared at him. The room, which had been beginning to murmur back to life, went quiet again. Joel said it again. "Just a moment." And something in his voice, not threatening, not loud, just absolute, made my father step back. Joel picked up the microphone. He said, "My name is Joel Reyes. I'm Mara's husband. We got married 8 days ago." He paused, and I watched 470 people absorb that detail. "Richard, I want to address something you said, because I think the room deserves accuracy. You mentioned that I'm not what I represent myself to be. I want to be transparent about that, since transparency appears to be the theme of the evening." He said, "I'm the founder and principal owner of Reyes Capital Holdings. We're a private real estate investment and acquisitions firm based here in Portland. I started it in 2016. Our current asset portfolio is valued at approximately $2.4 billion. I have managed that number carefully and privately because I learned a long time ago that money changes how people see you, and I wanted to know first that the people in my life were there for the right reasons." He paused again. 3 days ago, Coastal Pacific Group completed a transfer of their commercial real estate account to my company. They had been considering the move for about 18 months. I understand this represents a significant portion of the Ashford Group's current revenue, and I want to be clear, we did not pursue them. They came to us. Business is not personal. But this room is full of people who are Richard Ashford's business partners and stakeholders, and I think they deserve to know the full picture. He set the microphone back on the podium. He said, "Richard, I'm sorry to have taken the floor. I hope the rest of your evening is everything you've planned." Then he walked back to table 7 and sat down beside me. The room did not immediately combust. It didn't need to. What happened instead was a sequence of small, irreversible movements. The shift in posture of the man my father had been speaking to when Joel approached, who now looked at my father with a recalibrated expression, the murmuring that broke out at 4 or 5 tables simultaneously, the particular stillness of my father, who was still standing near the podium, whose face had undergone a rearrangement that I had never seen on it before, and the buzz of phones being discreetly retrieved from pockets and clutches by people who wanted to verify what they'd just heard. I leaned close to Joel and said, "$2.4 billion?" He said, "Closer to 2.6 now, but 2.4 felt more accurate for the moment." I said, "Joel." He said, "Yeah." 3 weeks later, everything exploded. Actually, that's not right. It didn't wait 3 weeks. Marcus Webb, the Ashford Group executive I'd spotted earlier, left the gala before dessert was served. 2 of my father's senior partners, who had been at the company for over a decade, came to our table before the end of the evening to introduce themselves to Joel with an attentiveness that would have been fawning if they'd had the time to be fawning, which they didn't, because they were processing the arithmetic in real time, and the arithmetic was not in my father's favor. My father did not speak to me again that night. He left the gala just after 10 o'clock, which was unprecedented. He had never left his own gala early in 15 years. My mother left with him, her expression sealed. Daniel left 5 minutes later. Over the following weeks, the Ashford Group entered a period that their lawyers would later describe as a period of operational restructuring, which is a polite way of saying that the loss of Coastal Pacific, combined with the revelation of its destination, combined with the very public nature of the revelation, created a confidence crisis among their remaining major clients. 2 other accounts opened conversations with Joel's company. One didn't move. One did. My father called me 11 days after the gala. He sounded, for the first time in my memory, like a man without a performance to give. His voice was flat. He said, "I want you to understand that I'm not calling to apologize." I waited. He said, "I'm calling because I need you to know that none of this was personal." I said, "Dad, I'm your daughter." He said, "I know that." I said, "Then what was it?" He couldn't answer. I don't think he had the architecture for the answer. The truth was that I had been, in his mind, a variable in the Ashford Group's social structure, and when Joel became a threat to that structure, he had made a calculation, and the calculation had been catastrophically wrong, and what he was calling to tell me was not that he understood why that was wrong, but that he wished the math had worked out differently. I said, "I love you. I think you're a deeply limited person in ways that have cost us both something real. And I'm not going to spend any more of my life waiting for you to be different." He said, "Mara." I said, "Take care of yourself, Dad." And I hung up. My mother sent a card 6 weeks later. Cream-colored, expensive, with her handwriting in blue ink. 3 sentences that managed to both apologize and assign responsibility to me in the same breath. I kept it for 2 days, then recycled it. Daniel called 4 months after the gala. He didn't apologize either, but he called, which for Daniel is its own kind of reaching out. We talked for 40 minutes. It was strange and uncomfortable and tentative, and also, somehow real. The realest conversation we'd had in years, possibly ever, because the architecture of the family mythology had collapsed, and we were just 2 people who'd grown up in the same house, trying to figure out if there was anything left between them worth preserving. We're not close, but we're not nothing either. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. I know that being underestimated is its own kind of freedom. I know that the people who looked through me, who didn't ask about my award, who talked over my answers, who called me a disappointment into a microphone in front of 500 people, were not seeing me. They were seeing a category, a slot in a structure. And when you're invisible to people who love status, you get to move in ways that visible people can't. I know that Joel Reyes built something extraordinary not in spite of being underestimated, but in some ways because of it. He learned early that if you don't announce yourself, you get to watch how people actually behave. You get to learn who they are when they think nothing important is at stake. And that information, if you're paying attention, is more valuable than any investment portfolio. I know that revenge is not a destination. It sounds like one. There's something deeply satisfying about imagining the moment of collapse, the public unmasking, the reckoning delivered in a ballroom in front of everyone who mattered, but the satisfaction is shorter than you expect, and what comes after is just your life, which is still yours to build. The Ashford Group still exists. My father still runs it, though at reduced scale, and the social standing he'd spent 40 years constructing has a hairline fracture in it now that won't fully close. Some people still invite him to things. Some don't. My mother still chairs her foundation committees. She still has lunches. She has reorganized her social identity around the careful omission of any mention of Joel or the gala, and she does it with such practiced fluency that I imagine there are people in her circle who don't know the story at all. Joel and I live in the penthouse now, full-time, because I finally let him show me what he'd been keeping quiet. We still go to the coffee shop on Saturday mornings. He still makes technical drawings at the table sometimes. I still correct his load calculations, which he insists is unnecessary, and which I am completely certain is not. 8 months ago, I left the engineering firm. Joel and I launched an architecture and development consulting practice together, small, selective, focused on sustainable commercial design. I do the structural work. He does the investment and acquisition strategy. We're good at it. We might be very good at it eventually. Last month, the State Engineering Association gave me a leadership award. It was a small ceremony, about 60 people, in a conference room with bad lighting and excellent coffee. I called nobody in my family. I took a photo and sent it to Joel, who was 3 time zones away for a meeting, and who sent back a voice message that I've kept on my phone and listen to sometimes when I need to remember what it sounds like when someone is genuinely, uncomplicated proud of you. I didn't win because they lost. I want to be honest about that. My father's company losing a client is not my victory. My mother's carefully maintained social world developing a crack is not something I celebrate. Even Daniel, who has quietly, in the months since the gala, begun to question things he'd accepted as fixed, even that is not a prize. It's just what happens when a structure that was built on something false starts to settle. I won because I stopped needing them to become the family they were never going to be. That's the whole of it. When I was sitting at that kitchen table at 18, not saying anything about the tuition money, I didn't have the language for what was happening. I didn't know yet that I was allowed to name it. I spent years interpreting my family's behavior as evidence of my own inadequacy, as something I could fix by being more impressive, more forgiving, more patient. But some stories are not about fixing. They're about understanding clearly, for the first time, that the problem was never yours. If you're watching this and you're the forgotten one, the child who didn't get the call, the sibling who wasn't in the photo, the person whose achievements got rerouted into silence at the dinner table, I want you to hear this. Your clarity is coming. And when it does, it won't feel like victory so much as relief. Just the enormous, uncluttered relief of finally knowing exactly what you're working with. Thank you for watching.